Good morning, everyone. Welcome to ethics class. Dr. Bogosian here. I hope you are hanging in there and having a good day so far. And I hope that you're finding the resources to enable yourself to finish strong this semester and to complete these last few weeks so that you can succeed in this class. Please be reminded that if you ever have any special needs or requests, whether it's in terms of understanding the material or in terms of your challenges that you're facing to access these lectures or access assignments and this sort of thing, please don't hesitate to reach out, send me an email, let me know what's going on, and you're also welcome to set up an appointment during either office hours or some other time we can agree on to chat about your situation and what it's going to take to help you get where you need to go to cross the finish line this semester. I do want to take a few minutes, and I'll be doing this a few times over the next handful of weeks here, or just really a few weeks before we end the term, to thank you for a wonderful semester, all things considered. I think we were having a great time even before we went to this stay-at-home order, but I appreciate your persistence and grit in digging deep to hang with me and be flexible and patient as we all navigated this transition to online teaching. Without further ado, I want to take us back into our discussion of end-of-life ethics. Today, we're going to look at the second part of a two-part series that we're kind of breaking this into. Today, we're going to look at a series of arguments on the side of the debate that is opposed to the practice of active euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide. And these are coming from the paper by Paul Chamberlain. Again, you can find both of these papers in PDF form in Module 16 for this week. You can also find the Zoom recording links for both lectures in the lecture content tab, as well as a detailed handout that follows along with both lectures. So let me go ahead and pull up my screen to share it with you. And then we will jump right in here. Okay, let me take a few minutes here. I want to start at the beginning and talk not only about our plan for today and next week, but your upcoming assignment due next week. We are, like I said, going to be finishing up end-of-life ethics today, and then heading into next week. As was mentioned in the announcement over last weekend, I have made a change to the topic for next week. And a lot of that has been motivated out of our current situation. I wanted to bring our content for this semester to a meaningful, kind of commonsensical, I guess you might say, close, a way of kind of bookending and wrapping things up. And in other semesters in the ethics class, I've had a unit on the good and meaningful life. That discussion is often discussed in ethics under value theory. And we just, have to make these tough choices of what to include and exclude in a class like this. It's an introductory level class. But I thought, given our current situation, it would be helpful to spend some time looking at a couple different views of what the meaning of life is, or what the good life to lead is. And there are lots of options. There are more than two options, as you can imagine. But I'm going to have you read from two well-known historic philosophical thinkers, philosophers, ethicists who talk really more about the moral life than, let's say, applied ethics topics per se. And that's Friedrich Nietzsche on the one hand and Soren Kierkegaard on the other hand. What's interesting about both of these figures is they both have been kind of placed within a period and stream of thought within the history of philosophy called existentialism. And so that'll be something unique to read for you, most of you. And something different than we've read all semester. But what I've done is, instead of having you read them in terms of firsthand primary sources, I've selected two chapters from an ethics book that I've used in another ethics class that's really good. That's kind of an overview of their views, and it has excerpts from some of their primary sources, which is much more manageable and easier to understand, and it kind of trims it down into a handful of pages each. So you can go over to module 16, and you can find those two PDFs. Those will be up by later today or tomorrow at the latest. And you'll want to read Nietzsche first, and Kierkegaard second, because we will go in that order. And there will be one lecture on each of their moral or their ethical systems and how they answer questions related to the good and meaningful life. That's important not only for next week's lecture content, but that's also important for your final assignment or assessment. That is your second discussion board. So you were going to have a discussion board next week anyways, but instead of being on animal rights ethics, we're going to just do it over these readings to streamline things, and that'll help you prepare for the lectures in viewing them and understanding them. It'll also help you in terms of preparation for the last exam, which I also want to get on the table and mention. The last exam, we don't have a midterm final format in this class. You might recall we have 3 exams total. The third exam was scheduled for May 14th, our last day of class. What we will do instead is I will open it on that day, so you could still theoretically take it Thursday, May 14th, but I will leave it open until through the weekend. So it'll be open from like the 14th through the 17th, okay? You won't be able to take that yet. So currently, the old exam link, which is really just the review guide, is open, and you can look at that. And then I will add some questions related to the Nietzsche Kierkegaard stuff for next week. And then what will happen is there'll be a new link, okay, for exam 2, and you'll need to make sure to click on that. I'll try to make that as clear as possible. And I understand that that was the case for exam 2. There were 2 links, but there's no way around that this time around because I'm having to create these new exams online for Canvas. But there'll be an online exam, and I'll start talking more about that next week in the final couple of lectures. And what I plan to do for our very last lecture, or at least our last week, so next week, as well as, week 17. Okay, so I misspoke there. The exam will be the 14th or the 17th. That is during week 17. So week 17, what we will do is there won't be any new lecture content, but I will have a couple of synchronous times where you can ask questions about the exam and where you will be able to ask questions about any of the content that we've lectured over these last few weeks asynchronously. And of course, those discussions will be recorded for those of you who are not able to join us during those times. I want you to be able to benefit from that exchange as well, so you can be adequately prepared for the exam. So basically what we're doing is we're giving you week 17 to prepare for and take exam 3, and you'll have the better of 4 days to decide when is best in that 4-day window to complete the exam. And then that'll be it for us. You'll be hearing these series of announcements, at least for the discussion board and exam 3 discussed in each of the next lectures. So please be patient with that. I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. I will also be posting these in the announcements over the weekend. All right, let's go ahead and jump into Paula Chamberlain's 6 arguments against physician-assisted suicide. The debate is usually what's called active euthanasia is usually about physician-assisted suicide. Although last time we saw in James Rachel's paper that he kind of understands active euthanasia broader than just having the help of a doctor to die. And we're going to go back to that a little bit. That's going to come up in Chamberlain's discussion today. But he thinks that the practice is immoral, and he is coming at it from a non-utilitarian standpoint. So his kind of argument could be seen as in the neighborhood of some kind of deontology, Kant or Ross or someone, or even there'll be some natural law elements or Aristotelian elements. So there's a lot here that could work with different theories that we talked about this semester. So here we go. Let's first look at some background questions and a key story he starts with, similar to how James Rachel started. Let's take Sue Rodriguez, right? And Sue Rodriguez is this person who is terminally ill, and she wants to consent to her own death. She doesn't want to have to wait for her condition to play out. And so the question is, should she have the right to consent to her own death? And Chamberlain thinks that the answer is no. Even if she gives her consent, it's not happening against her will. We don't have a right to consent to certain kinds of things that would be objectively bad or harmful to oneself. So we have obligations, right, as a society to keep people from consenting to horrible things, even towards their own body. So our bodily autonomy goes a certain distance, but it's not without boundaries, okay? And this is something that we've talked about before this semester, right? So generally we think suicide is wrong. Someone who is having a bad week or a bad year, and they're up on top of the building, they want to jump, and we're trying to talk them off the building. Well, why? Well, because we think, well, even if they're saying they consent to their death, we're trying to talk them out of it precisely because we think consent isn't sufficient, right? And that's an underlying assumption that Chamberlain is working with here. Number two, let's ask a question. Is society obligated to grant her wish for physician-assisted suicide if she thinks her psychological and physical suffering is unbearable? Chamberlain thinks the answer is no. James Rachels thinks the answer is yes, but we're going to see 6 reasons why Chamberlain thinks the answer is no. And he wants to parse out, right? He thinks there's an important moral difference between refusing medical treatment and consenting to physician-assisted suicide. And so Rachel's side is asking, well, look, if you can refuse to be on respirators and feeding tubes, why can't you consent to hastening the death process? Chamberlain is going to answer those questions as he goes today. So what's his first reason for thinking that you do not have a right to die? You do not have a right to die at your own pace or at your own timing or wishes. Number one, it actually harms you and it harms society. Okay, it harms individuals, the individuals receiving that treatment, and it harms society. All right. Pro-physician-assisted suicide advocates like James Rachels argue that personal autonomy gives us a right to choose to die gently and peacefully in order to avoid unbearable suffering. And suffering here usually is understood in psychological terms, but it could also have a physical. Pain is usually the physical sensation. Suffering is the psychological effects of pain. And so here we think of duress, and the pain and the suffering that goes along with pain. And so Chamberlain has numerous responses to this. He says, well, look, wanting to perform some action, which is the case of the person like Sue, who wants to die with the help of a doctor. Wanting to perform some act is not sufficient rationally or morally to its being morally allowed or permissible. And how do we know whether it's why is it not sufficient? Well, because one's choice, right, could be a harmful act to oneself or others. And so let's take someone who is a cutter, cut themselves because of certain pain and suffering, let's say they're experiencing in their daily lives. Well, we often think that them wanting to do that to their bodies is not sufficient for it being a good thing for them. And this is why a psychologist, right, and a parent or both of them will try to talk them away from that sort of activity because it's objectively harmful to their body. And it's not the best way to react, let's say, to their situation. By analogy, this is what Chamberlain thinks about physician-assisted suicide. Simply because Sue Rodriguez or anyone else wants to die, that's insufficient for it being morally permissible. Well, why? Because it harms them. It harms them. Why? Well, because it harms them in 3 ways, he thinks. Number one, oftentimes people who have, let's say, especially terminal illnesses, begin to feel like they're burdening their loved ones. They're burdening their loved ones financially. They're burdening their loved ones emotionally. They're burdening their loved ones in terms of stress on their lives. And so now internally, even if they don't verbalize it, they feel this duty to die, like their life has lost significance and meaning, right? And so it harms them by placing an undue burden on them. Chamberlain thinks it is wrong of us to implicitly or even explicitly make people feel like they're a burden and therefore need to consent to dying. And so if physician-assisted suicide harms someone by putting an undue burden on them, it would be wrong. Harm number 2, let's imagine a rebuttal, right? Someone like James Rachels might say, but look, we could put safeguards in place to where a person can't just be kind of pressured into this, saying that they want to die when in fact it's just that their children are pressuring them to kind of move this process along so they don't spend too much of their money in assisted living or on medical expenses, etc. Well, this is where maybe we can put a proviso in place legally where two doctors have to evaluate the patient and consent to their receiving physician-assisted suicide. I'm going to refer to it as PAS for short from here on out. Now, that's an often offered response from those who are pro-PAS. But Chamberlain thinks that as good as that sounds in theory, in practice, safeguards cannot kind of assuage, right, someone's feelings that they have a duty to die. They can still feel that way and feel internal pressure regardless of whether it takes two doctors to consent. And so they might still, out of feeling this internal pressure, say certain things to two doctors, in other words, to get them to consent. And so the concern Chamberlain has here is that this inner burden, this psychological burden that people feel, actually is very weighty and it harms them. And therefore, the practice harms them by way of pressuring them. Harm number two, people are often misdiagnosed with having a terminal illness when in fact they don't. This is unintentional, right? But misdiagnoses happens. Misdiagnoses happen all the time in the medical arena. And we would like it to not be the case, but it happens, right? Because humans are subject to error. And so then what happens is if you're told you have 6 weeks to live because you have cancer of a certain type or because you have advanced stages of HIV, and then you're preparing to die and you say, well, look, I don't want to have a long, extenuating, painful death. I want to get my affairs in order and go and have a doctor help me die. Well, the problem with that is, let's suppose your cancer isn't of the right kind. It's misdiagnosed. Maybe you do have cancer, but it's something you could live for many years. Or maybe you only have early stages of HIV and that could be treated and you could live a relatively healthy 5 or 10, 15 more years. The problem here then is, because we could get it wrong and the death process is, the death is irreversible, right? We shouldn't allow physician-assisted suicide because it actually is an irredeemable, irrevocable harm. Harm number three, PAS entails valuing some humans less than others. Now, this is where he's kind of trying to go after a deep underlying inconsistency in the pro-PAS side of James Rachel's. So it takes someone who's depressed or able-bodied. Now, let's say we value them less than a terminally ill or elderly person who doesn't have long to live. Well, what does that mean? Well, because let's suppose a depressed person could live another 20 years as a depressed person, but they feel like they have unbearable psychological suffering, and it's just riddling their lives, and they can't cope, and they can't get out of bed, and they don't want to go to work, and they feel like they've lost all hope and meaning. And even though they're able-bodied, we're valuing them less, saying they don't have a right to die, but the person who's terminally ill does, which is what many people, though not just James Rachel's, but many advocates say, well, we'll draw the line at terminal illness. But the reality is that's unfair, right? That seems to value people who have other unbearable conditions that are not physical, that are mental. We privilege them less, and we tend to privilege the terminal ill more. And that is to be morally inconsistent. And therefore, we're harming those who we're valuing less, right? We're devaluing them. Now, his point isn't that we should open it up to everybody. His point is that, well, by parity of reasoning, we shouldn't allow it to anyone. If we think it's a harm in the case of the depressed, able-bodied person, we should see it as a harm in the case of the non-depressed, terminally ill person. The bottom line here is he's making the argument of what's called parity of reasoning. We have to be consistent in our reasoning. If compassion and autonomy require PAS in terminally ill cases, they should also be allowed for depressed and cognitively disabled cases like we've considered along the way. Since he doesn't think we should, and most think we shouldn't allow it for a depressed 19-year-old, we shouldn't allow it in someone who's 90 and terminally ill. Argument number two, he thinks that the killing and letting die are not morally equivalent. So remember, James Rachel's argued that they are morally equal. He's going to push back on that. Number one, removing of life support and physician-assisted suicide both aim to reduce suffering of the patient, so they're the same. That was James Rachel's argument. Chamberlain thinks this is a bad argument, number one, because the cause of death is different. Remember, the cause of death by removing life support is not the removing of life support. The cause of death is that the body cannot live on its own. And so it's dying of natural causes. And we're all going to die one way or another, whether that's a heart attack or cancer or your body just wears out. But it's the body that causes the death, not the removing of life support. The life support is almost like an artificial life-sustaining deal, right? Whereas in the case of PAS, the cause of death is the doctor helping the patient die, right? It's the intentional ending of their life with the lethal dose of something that's injected into an IV, or they drink, or they, get in their system somehow. So the final cause of death isn't the cancer. The final cause of death is the lethal dose. And so this is where intention also comes in here, right? When someone removes life support, they're intending to allow the person to die, right? Letting them die. Whereas when you inject someone with a large dose of that's lethal, a lethal dose of something, that not only causes their death, but it intends their death, right? And that is the intentional killing of the person. Number two, motives and intentions are a moral game changer, right? The difference between vehicular homicide, accidental homicide, and first-degree murder are important. Now, they're both weighty, right? And you're going to be punished severely for both. But first-degree murder is premeditated. The person intends it. They set out to accomplish that, and that's morally and legally more significant than accidental homicide. The same is the case with all sorts of things, right? The person who intentionally lies versus the person who thinks they're telling the truth, really genuinely, but is told a falsehood. Right? We hold those to different degrees of moral weight. The same should be the case here. If the cause of death is the intentional taking of the person's life by way of a lethal dose, that's morally different. That intention matters. Whereas the removal of life support that would just be futile and won't help the person, that's a different intention. Excuse me. That's the intention is to allow them to die of natural causes. Removing of life support aims at discontinuing futile treatment. The death is the indirect result of removing the life support. The nature of the condition is direct, however, with PAS, right? The cause of death, the COD, is direct versus indirect. And so those are morally different. PAS continues one's life unnaturally and directly. Okay? In the case of removing of life support, the nature of the condition is the direct cause of death. The cancer is the direct cause of death, let's say. In physician-assisted suicide, it's the acts of the doctor that are the direct cause of death. Removing of life support in terminal cases reduces prolonged suffering. And here we need to think about how advanced hospice care is in maintaining or managing pain states, helping people die as comfortably as they can. And some of you may have had friends or loved ones that you have gone through hospice. I have. And hospice, right, the whole goal of it is really to physically, mentally, spiritually, if a person is religious, help them have all those resources to end their last days as peacefully and compassionately as possible. And so removal of life support is not necessarily prolonging suffering. It's trying to reduce that as best as we can while allowing nature to run its course. And PAS doesn't do that, right? It essentially puts someone down. And so the intention, while they say is to reduce suffering, the primary intention is to end their life. Argument 3, Paul Chamberlain says, look, there isn't a slippery slope, the fallacy of a slippery slope being committed by his side of the argument. Okay, so his side of the argument says, look, if we allow PAS, it's going to be misused and abused, okay, and people are going to be put to death unfairly, right, unethically. So here we go. Chamberlain says, well, look, there's not a slippery slope here. There actually is evidence in other countries and other places where PAS is legal that it's it can't be contained and regulated, even as much as we might like to talk about safeguards. And so there's no clear way to contain and regulate it, okay? And the pro-PAS person might say back, look, well, let's say you have to have 2 doctors to consent, and it has to be a terminal illness, blah, 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 blah. And therefore, possible abuses doesn't make the practice wrong. Okay, Chamberlain says, well, look, this is his rejoinder. He says, some slippery slopes are legitimate arguments, right? So slippery slope in logic says if we do A, we're going to have to do S. But there are all these letters, right? Steps in between A and S. And so maybe if we do A, we won't have to do S. Well, here he's saying, look, if we do A, what's going to happen, right, is S, right? And so it's legit if we can fill in those steps to show the link. Some slippery slopes are legit because of the seriousness, right, of the abuse, especially for vulnerable people. Between A and S, let's say, are all these vulnerable people. These are people who are cognitively disabled, physically disabled, the elderly, the terminally ill, people who could be seen by family and society as just being dead weight, lacking in value to contribute to societal flourishing, but just being sort of a suck on society. And these people are ultimately vulnerable, right? They can't defend themselves or protect themselves from such harms. And he thinks it's society's duty, right, to disallow any kind of activity, to illegalize, right, to make it illegal for any activity that could harm them. The Netherlands is a great test case here, and you could go Google this later. Euthanasia has been legal there for many, many years. And it is, I don't have the exact numbers handy here, but you can look at it. The numbers are very high, not only of how many people receive physician-assisted suicide, but how often the elderly who are not terminally ill receive it, simply because they're elderly and they're taking up space in a convalescent home. They're using social, financial, and other resources. Depressed persons ask for PAS all the time, and because they argue that psychological suffering is equal to physical suffering. And the safeguards there conflict with their personal autonomy. So they argue that, well, look, these safeguards are actually, again, unfair. They treat them differently than the terminally ill. And so there are cases where depressed people sort of under the table get the ability to get help with ending their lives. The elderly, those who are, cognitively unable to take care of themselves and defend themselves. And so there are also economic and family incentives, right, to where 30 to 70% of the healthcare costs are incurred in the final 60 to 90 days of a person's life. So let's suppose you're into day 10 of what looks to be the last 90 days of a person's life. And you know as a doctor, and even as a family member, that the cost to the family and to the hospital could be very high. Well, you're very financially motivated, right, to end their life early, right, to end it before 60 or 90 days. You're going to save the hospital and your family potentially a lot of money. Also, families experience a long, drawn-out emotional drain. It's very draining to be with someone, right, for the remaining 60 to 90 days of their life, where they could die at any moment. Maybe they become less coherent. You're trying to find it within yourself to let go and to have those hard last conversations. And so families are motivated due to that strain and the financial burdens to ask a doctor to administer PAS, even if, let's say, their family member would not have wanted that. So number 4, there's an argument from the pro-PAS side that says, well, look, if we allow people to put their dog or their cat or whatever, their animal, non-human animal down if they're sick. Or if they become violent, right? But we don't let humans be put down, like when they're terminally ill. We're actually treating our dogs better than we do humans. That's not cool. That's not okay. Well, Chamberlain says that this is a false sort of argument, right? It's an unsound argument. Well, why? Because non-human animal suffering is different than protecting humans from murder, right? He's not saying that we should let non-human animals suffer. It's just that their suffering is different, and we don't see putting them down as murdering them, and nor should we, right? But the case with a human being who is a moral agent, when you intentionally take their life, that by definition is murder. And so we have an obligation to protect them from such harms. Next here, laws against helping you kill others protects us all, and not only the terminally ill person, right? It protects everyone from potential abuses, where let's say a family could conspire against a family member to have them put down if they have a terminal disease or they're depressed or they're old. You know, maybe the children are financially motivated because the parents are wealthy and are going to leave them a lot of money. Third here, the law prohibits helping suicidal folks die. You might recall a case we talked about earlier in the semester of the young woman a year or two ago who was on the phone, right, with her friend or boyfriend, and basically he was suicidal, and she said, yeah, well, just if that's what you want to do, go do it. Well, now she ended up going to jail for that, right? Well, why? Because he's vulnerable, and what the law deems he needs in that time, morally speaking, is help to reverse course, right? To stop what he's doing and find reasons to live and find help, the right help. And once he's gone, that's a irreversible decision. Now, says Chamberlain, that's an indicator that we should take the same approach with physician-assisted suicide. People who want to die, who are vulnerable, should not be helped to do that. They should receive good psychological care, social services, hospice, or what have you, but we shouldn't help them die. Also, in addition to this, the safeguards that are often suggested are very weak. They can be manipulated. They're vague, and they can't be relied on because they're vague and they're weak. They're often changing and complicated even to interpret because medical cases are very hard and murky. They're complex. And so we shouldn't trust safeguards to keep PAS from being abused or misused. And so there isn't any inconsistency with what we're going for here. We're trying to protect human beings whose lives have intrinsic worth and they're worthy of dignity and respect. And so we need to keep that in mind. Argument number 5. Oftentimes people will say, well, look, let's suppose that someone wants to die, they're suicidal, whether they're depressed or whether they have a terminal illness, but then they're unsuccessful and it's a botched suicide. Maybe they live even a worse off life after their botched suicide. And so this is one reason to allow physicians to help them, because they'll be successful and it won't be messy, right? It'll be less harm and more good than harm. He said, look, no, this is the wrong way to go at this. This is very utilitarian. This isn't a cost-benefit thing in terms of pain and suffering. Utilitarian reasoning doesn't help us justify helping people die. There's a false underlying principle here that if people will violate the law, right, against, let's say, suicide, we should change the law. Hey, people are going to do it anyway, so let's just change the law. And he says, look, that's a really bad principle, morally speaking. The fact that people are going to do anything immoral doesn't mean we should just say, well, let's sign off on it. And he's concerned about this on a broad social level, but especially applied to PAS. Well, people are going to attempt this anyways. Well, let's just legalize it. Well, no, okay, consistency would require that we legalize a host of other bad things, right? People are going to murder anyways, right? Those gangsters are going to go kill each other. Let's just legalize murder. People are going to assault one another. Let's just let them do it. Well, no, that's clearly flawed reasoning morally and legally. And so by analogy, right, we should think the same thing of PAS. The fact that people are going to attempt suicide and botch it doesn't give us good grounds for legalizing it. Instead, we should figure out how to help people, right, come alongside of them in these cases to prevent suicide. Last but not least, the 6th argument against euthanasia is the democratic argument. Really, this is a critique of the argument. The democratic argument is offered on behalf of those in favor of physician-assisted suicide. They say, look, we should just take a poll, take a vote, and give people what they want. And the majority seem to want at least the option to receive PAS. And so it's their country too. They should have that as a live option. Excuse me, my allergies are bad today. And so it's unfair in a democratic society to not take a vote on this. We should essentially give the majority what they want. Chamberlain has a few replies. Number 1, the will of the people isn't a reliable indicator of what is right. In fact, people's wills are often changing. We can get people kind of fired up, right, and get groupthink going and the bandwagon going. And so their will is often hard to discern, much less is it easy to discern whether their will is rational and therefore moral. Number two, the will of the people is unreliable as a method for deciding difficult moral and legal issues. In fact, we have historical precedent where, excuse me, the will of the people has been radically misguided. It has led to deep, long standing harms, right? Slavery comes to mind, racism, sexism, and so on. And so while democracy is good as far as it goes, it's not a reliable indicator necessarily of what should be legal. We shouldn't just take a poll on everything, right? We need to have the moral reasoning done and use that to sort of rein in the will of the people, or rein in the will of the individual as well. Might doesn't make right, okay? This is going to tie into Nietzsche next week, okay? Might makes right comes up in Nietzsche. The reason might doesn't make right, so some people in the Nietzschean strain say, will to power. Whatever the mighty want to do, that makes it right. Whatever the majority wants to do. Well, again, the mighty could be tyrannical. The majority might be totally off base. And the fact that the majority or the powerful want to do something doesn't necessarily indicate that it's what's right and good or what's best. Nor does it indicate that that's the best way to live. So to wrap up for today, I want to leave you with a couple questions for you to think about. And then if you have any questions about either Chamberlain or Rachel's, feel free to reach out to me. Otherwise, have a great day. Make sure to go and not only watch the previous lecture, but make sure to look for the readings for next week on The Good and Meaningful Life by Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, and do a great job with the discussion board. I look forward to reading those. Take care.